Many years ago, under the UPP administration, two banks in Antigua and Barbuda were utilized to launder billions of dollars by Odebrecht. I said under the UPP. Okay. Mr. Speaker, more specifically, from about 2006 until 2014, two banks in Antigua and Barbuda were utilized to launder billions of dollars to bribe individuals, government officials, and others who are awarding contracts globally. In fact, the bribery was considered to be the most extended bribery machine ever invented by man. It should be noted, though, Mr. Speaker, that the money laundering took place under the UPP administration, in which Antigua Overseas Bank and Minel Bank were utilized to launder billions of dollars. The main person who was literally an employee of Odebrecht, who was responsible for the Antigua operation, was a gentleman by the name of Louis Franca. The gentleman was appointed by the UPP administration as an honorary consul, as an ambassador representing Antigua and Barbuda in Brazil. It is evident that that person needed immunity based on the business that he was involved in, and he sought to get the appointment from the UPP administration in order to achieve some level of immunity. So he received it, he requested it, and he received it from the UPP. We're not sure what funds were paid or what gifts were offered precisely for that appointment, but we are aware, Mr. Speaker, that it came at a cost. And it also came at a cost in the sense that Antigua and Barbuda is now known to be the country that facilitated the largest bribery machinery in the history of the world. That happened under the UPP administration. At the time, Mr. Speaker, when all this was taking place, at least from 2009, the finance minister was one Mr. Harold Lovell. And based on Mr. Lovell's own account, after he lost office in 2014, he became a consultant to Minel Bank and Odebrecht. And let me make it abundantly clear here that Minel Bank was majority owned by Odebrecht. They owned about 77%, somewhere like that, of the shares in Minel Bank. So it is evident that the leader of the UPP had a relationship with Minel Bank, with Odebrecht and Franca, who was the chief operations officer to launder money here. Mr. Lovell as well also confirmed in the public domain that he has held private meetings with Mr. Franca in Miami, ostensibly to assist them with certain operations. Mr. Speaker, in about 2016, the story broke that there was this major bribery operation taking place in Antigua and Barbuda. The officials associated with Odebrecht were convicted in the U.S. court. And what happened at that time is that a claim was made, Mr. Speaker, that they paid a former ambassador. In fact, he was not even fully appointed as an ambassador, but he was an ambassador designate, Mr. Kazroy James, that they offered him 4 million euros, ostensibly to bribe the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, who at the time was me and still is the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda. That was documented in the U.S. court documents to confirm that certain funds were paid and that the intended recipient was the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda. However, the Odebrecht officials and Kazroy never held any discussions with me. So no one could have represented on my behalf that they were representing the Prime Minister or the government of Antigua and Barbuda. What we do know is that certain business arrangements were being made between Kazroy James and the Odebrecht officials, represented by Louis Franca, and that Mr. Harry Lovell was somewhere in the mix. In fact, we were able to present evidence of payments that were made to Mr. Harry Lovell. I would have stated categorically that at no point would I have met with anyone from Odebrecht, from Minel Bank, or any of its associates in Miami, in Spain, or anywhere in the world. In fact, these are not people who I knew, and up to this point, I do not know them. Even Franca, whose appointment continued under our government, I do not know the man. He was appointed by the UPP as an ambassador, and he's not a friend of mine, never held any discussions with him. In fact, Franca also said in court in Brazil that Odebrecht officials on one occasion flew from Brazil to Miami, and they came to Antigua during the opening of the airport, the opening ceremony of the airport terminal, VC Bird Airport Terminal. And the plan was to have a discussion with me about this arrangement, about funds that they were going to pay ostensibly to get the government to withhold certain information from law enforcement in Brazil. So they did travel to Antigua. They were introduced to me. But he said in court, Mr. Speaker, that they never held any discussions with me about the transaction and that I gave no undertakings. So this is a crook who said in the court documents in Brazil that no discussions ever took place with me. Now, Mr. Speaker, we know that the entities involved, that they never held any discussions with me. And if you have to look at this issue rationally, what is the probability of me arranging to have some form of clandestine transaction with crooks, which will involve an ambassador and ostensibly a lawyer who everyone believes to be Harry Lovell, who at the time was my chief political opponent? It is just totally rational. And I'm not saying here that Mr. Lovell took any bribe from them, because clearly he was acting in his personal capacity, so the issue of a bribe would not have arisen. It could have been that between himself and the former ambassador, that they could have given an undertaking that they could get the Prime Minister to act in a certain way in exchange for funds. And the reason why I come to that conclusion, Mr. Speaker, is because one, Ms. Donna Shawyer said to me subsequently, and she would have stated that publicly, that she recalled meeting Harry Lovell in Miami at some point at the Biltmore Hotel. In fact, I have never been to the Biltmore Hotel. I had the opportunity to go there subsequently and refuse. And that during discussions with Mr. Lovell, he advised her that he had met with some Brazilians and that he was about to get a significant amount of money, millions of dollars, to fund his campaign. Now, Mr. Speaker, and I think that is why she's so strongly against him and the things that he's saying, because he would have told her that he was about to get millions of dollars. But, Mr. Speaker, if funds were paid into a particular account, and Mr. Lovell and a particular ambassador had a relationship, and Mr. Lovell stated in confidence to someone that certain funds will be available, millions of dollars, to help him to fight the 2018 general elections, then certain conclusions could be made. Now, having said that, the ambassador said, Mr. Speaker, that the funds were part of a CIP transaction. He would have written formally to that effect. He also concluded, too, that he never had any discussions with me. I never instructed him to represent me. So that is in the public domain. Now, he may well be right. We don't know what the facts are. The discussions would have been between Harry Lovell, Kaz Roy, and the Odebrecht officials, not Gaston Browne. I had no dealings with them. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, well, you see, the issue about an inquiry, Mr. Speaker, inquiry, this is a matter that went before the Brazilian courts as well as the courts in the United States, fully ventilated issue. So they are recommending that if I am of the view that Harold Lovell would have done something wrong, we should have an investigation. I'm saying to you here that because Harold Lovell would have gone there in his private capacity as a lawyer, that he would not have done anything illegal. So the issue of a public inquiry does not arise. In my particular case, Mr. Speaker, there is no litigation against me. In fact, I travel freely to the United States. And even Kaz Roy, who one can perhaps speculate may have been involved in that particular transaction and that it was not a CIP transaction, he too seemed to have actually, well, he's able to travel freely. He was here up to recently, so there's no case against him either. So the question is, what is the basis for this public inquiry? If, for example, Mr. Speaker, that a firm, let's say, allegation was made against me, and there was some form of circumstantial evidence, then I can understand. But the very crook said in court, and the documents are there, that they never held any discussions with me. Now, if anyone understood the process of withholding information, and let us understand too, Mr. Speaker, first of all, there was no mens rea. The government at all times and government officials acted in accordance with the laws of Antigua and Barbuda. So contrary to the request of the Brazilians, the documentation was submitted to Brazilian law enforcement. Now, if indeed, Mr. Speaker, the documentation was not submitted, then one can say, well, okay, fine, there must have been a reason why we did not share the information. But those who tried to concoct that deal, Mr. Speaker, did not understand the process of sharing information. That process has nothing at all to do with the Prime Minister. First of all, information comes to the authority, I believe the Attorney General and the DPP, forwarded to the ONDCP, and then the ONDCP takes all of the action to get the court orders, to get the documentation, and to share the information. I had the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, early and bright, as soon as the story broke, within a matter of probably an hour, I summoned an immediate emergency cabinet meeting, called Mr. Croft before the cabinet. That's all I said to him when I called him, that is a matter of urgency, you need to come before the cabinet. And I asked him to tell the cabinet what he knew about any involvement, if I ever called him about not sharing information, if Kaz Roy James ever called him. He said no. And to the contrary, he provided evidence confirming that the information was shared. So it could have been to Mr. Speaker, and I'm speculating here, that Harold Lovell et al. Were running a program to rip off these people of, I shouldn't say rip off, but to probably fleece, or maybe not fleece, but at least get the money to campaign with, and giving them undertakings which they could not effect, that they could get the Prime Minister to take certain action. That's the only thing I can speculate there. But Harold thinks that he's smart. He knows that he did not commit any criminal action. So he's now trying to spin it and say, well, okay, fine. If I committed any criminal action, call a commission of inquiry. We never said that Mr. Lovell did anything criminally. All we know is that he was somewhere in the loop and was being paid. There's not 1 cent that was paid to me, directly or indirectly. I never had any discussion with anyone, directly or indirectly, soliciting any monies from Odebrecht or any associate of Odebrecht. So I hope, Mr. Speaker, that I would have shed some light in it. I know that to have a public inquiry, you're looking for some kind of maybe scandal inquiry. That serves no purpose. If you can provide any evidence that I participated directly or indirectly in any request for any bribery, of course, fine. I'll call investigation. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I went as far as getting an attorney in the United Kingdom to write the BBC and El País in Spain. It cost me over $20-something thousand because they mentioned that the Odebrecht officials said that the monies are intended for me. And I asked them to provide the evidence. They couldn't. As a result, the information was redacted. I never got any local attorney to issue any statement on my behalf. I've dealt with this matter frontally on each occasion because there's no information. It's just an allegation, and it could well be that that was intention. I'm not doubting that. The other side of the story is that one of the persons involved said it was a CIP transaction. I can't vouch for that. I don't know. And the company in which the funds were held, apparently the funds were there for about, 18 months? So you're telling me that with all of my financial needs, I'm going to thief money and let somebody hold it for me? Y'all get real now? I know y'all want to score cheap political points.
I think the Prime Minister has utilized his time.
Sorry?
Your time in reply has been fulsome.
Okay, so I hope that you would have gotten the gist of it. The reality is, I don't see the basis in which we could have called a public inquiry. First of all, no one in the private capacity could be implicated. There's no evidence that the Prime Minister or any official, Colonel Croft, the AG, the Director of Public Prosecution, that any of us gave any undertaking to withhold information. No quid pro quo, no monies passed, no case. You are looking scandal.